James Walker sat on his small wooden porch, staring at the faded American flag that still hung proudly outside his modest home. A decorated war veteran, James had given decades of his life to the country, serving overseas in hostile lands. Now at 62, his knees were weak, his pension barely covered groceries, and his medical bills piled up like an enemy he couldn't fight. That morning, a white SUV rolled up to his driveway. Out stepped Richard Miller, the smug president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Behind him followed two board members, Mrs. Turner, who always looked like she'd bitten into a lemon, and Carl, who carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Mr. Walker," Richard said with false politeness, "we've reviewed the HOA's records. You're in violation of multiple bylaws. Your lawn is uneven, your mailbox is chipped, and your shed is 2 feet outside of regulation distance. The fines total $10,000. James blinked, stunned. $10,000? I don't even have $1,000 to spare, he said, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. Mrs. Turner sniffed. Rules are rules. If you can't pay, the HOA has the right to place a lien on your property. Eventually, we'll foreclose. It's nothing personal. Nothing personal. The words echoed in James's head like gunfire. He'd risked his life for these very people, and now they wanted to strip away the only roof he had left. His late wife had planted roses by the porch. His daughter had taken her first steps in the living room, and every scarred brick of that house carried his blood and sweat. To lose it over petty fines felt like betrayal worse than any battlefield. "Listen," James said quietly. "I've served my country. I've bled for this flag. You really want to put an old soldier on the street because of a mailbox?" Richard smirked. "This isn't about the flag, Mr. Walker. It's about standards. Willow Creek is a community of excellence. If you can't afford to maintain that, maybe you don't belong here." Carl scribbled something on his clipboard, already preparing the paperwork. James felt his fists tighten. He wasn't a man who picked fights anymore, but deep inside, a fire lit up. The same fire that had carried him through dark nights in foreign deserts. As the HOA board turned to leave, Richard tossed one last comment over his shoulder. "You have 30 days, Walker, pay up, or we take everything." James sat there long after they'd gone, the weight of $10,000 pressing down on his chest. He looked at the house, at the flag, at the life he'd built. A storm brewed inside him, and for the first time in years, the veteran in him stirred awake. What the HOA didn't know was that James Walker wasn't just a broke old soldier. He had something they didn't expect, something that, in a matter of weeks, would make him the owner of half their precious neighborhood. That night, James couldn't sleep. He sat in his recliner with a mug of black coffee, staring at the stack of bills on his table. His war medals, still polished and gleaming, hung on the wall above him. They reminded him of battles fought, victories won, and comrades lost. Compared to those days, this HOA threat should have felt small, yet somehow it cut deeper. James whispered to himself. "They think I'm powerless. They think they can bully me like I'm just some broken old man." But he wasn't powerless. He still had discipline, strategy, and something far more valuable than cash knowledge. The next morning, James drove his old Ford pickup to the county courthouse. His boots echoed on the marble floor as he entered the records office. Behind the counter, a young clerk looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" James leaned forward. "I want to see all property filings, deeds, and liens for Willow Creek subdivision, every single one." The clerk raised an eyebrow, but after a moment, she shrugged. "It's public record. Give me a minute." Hours passed as James pored over thick binders and digital screens. What he found was like discovering cracks in an enemy's fortress. Many homeowners in Willow Creek were behind on dues. Several properties were already under liens filed by the HOA itself, and one thing stood out. Richard Miller, the HOA president, had quietly transferred several community lots into a holding company he controlled. The man was using the HOA as his personal cash cow. James's eyes narrowed. He'd seen corruption overseas, but to find it festering here in his own neighborhood lit a fire in his chest. He copied every document, every deed, every shady transfer. By the time he left the courthouse, the sun was setting, and a new battle plan was forming in his mind. That night, James called his old army buddy, Frank Delgado, now a real estate attorney. Frank answered on the second ring. "Walker, it's been years, what's up, brother?" James didn't waste time. "Frank, I need your help. I've got an HOA trying to bleed me dry for 10 grand. But I've found something. Bigger corruption. Fraud. Maybe even embezzlement. Can you meet me?" There was a pause. Then Frank chuckled. "Still fighting wars, huh? Text me the address, I'll be there." Within days, Frank confirmed James's suspicions. Richard's holding company wasn't just suspicious, it was borderline illegal. Worse, if the HOA couldn't collect dues, it risked bankruptcy. Frank leaned back in his chair, grinning. "James, you don't have to fight this with cash. You can fight it with the law. If you play this right, you could buy these properties out from under them for pennies." James's heart pounded. "You mean I could own the neighborhood?" Frank shrugged. "Stranger things have happened, and with your veteran benefits and some legal loopholes, you've got leverage they'll never see coming." For the first time in weeks, James smiled. The HOA thought they'd cornered him. Instead, they had pushed him into a battlefield he understood well. One of patience, planning, and striking at the perfect moment. As he looked out his window at the rows of houses under the HOA's thumb, James whispered to himself, "They want to fight? They just picked the wrong soldier." The following week, the HOA board gathered in their shiny clubhouse for a scheduled meeting. Residents sat in folding chairs, murmuring complaints about fees, lawn inspections, and Richard Miller's heavy-handed leadership. James arrived quietly, wearing a plain jacket and carrying a folder under his arm. He sat in the back, watching Richard strutted to the podium with his usual arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, maintaining Willow Creek's excellence requires funds. Some residents," he sneered, glancing at James, "have failed to comply. As a result, we will be increasing monthly dues and enforcing stricter penalties." Groans and whispers filled the room. James rose slowly, his voice calm but commanding. "Mr. Miller, before you push more fines on hardworking families, maybe you should explain why several community lots were transferred to your holding company last spring, without board approval." The room went dead silent. Richard froze, his smug grin vanishing. Mrs. Turner's face drained of color. James held up copies of the deeds. "I spent some time at the courthouse. These documents are public record. Care to explain why the HOA president is quietly moving community assets into his own pocket?" The crowd erupted, neighbors shouting, demanding answers. Richard stammered, That's a gross misinterpretation." But James wasn't finished. He slapped another paper on the podium. "And here's something better. Several liens filed by the HOA are legally unenforceable. You've been threatening families with foreclosure that can't even hold up in court. I have a real estate attorney, a decorated veteran like me, who's prepared to challenge every one of these fraudulent actions." Richard's jaw tightened. He shot James a look of pure hatred. "You think you can come in here and undermine me? You don't know how this works, Walker." James stepped closer, his voice low but deadly firm. "I know bullies, Miller. I fought them overseas, and I'll fight them here. The difference is, this battlefield has laws, and the law isn't on your side." The meeting ended in chaos. Neighbors swarmed James, thanking him, asking questions, whispering about taking down the HOA. For the first time, the community saw Richard not as a leader, but as a predator. Over the next days, James and Frank launched their offensive. They filed legal motions, challenged fraudulent liens, and alerted county officials to the shady transfers. Frank even hinted at launching a class action lawsuit on behalf of the residents. Then came the masterstroke. At a foreclosure auction for several HOA seized homes, James quietly placed bids. With veteran housing grants, low-interest loans, and a little help from Frank's legal maneuvering, he won multiple properties for fractions of their value. When Richard learned that James had just acquired 3 homes in Willow Creek, his face turned red with rage. He stormed into James's yard one evening. "You think this is over? You think you can humiliate me?" James didn't flinch. He looked the man straight in the eye. "It's not over, Miller. It's just the beginning. You tried to take my home. Now I'm taking your kingdom, one house at a time." And with that, the war for Willow Creek truly began. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere in Willow Creek began to change. What once felt like Richard Miller's kingdom was slowly slipping through his fingers. James, once dismissed as a poor veteran on the verge of losing his home, now walked the neighborhood with a new kind of authority. He didn't boast or wave papers around. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. James had acquired several homes at auction, and word spread fast. He wasn't just defending himself. He was quietly becoming a landlord within Willow Creek. Families who had lived in fear of Richard's fines and letters now came to James for advice. On a sunny Saturday morning, a group of neighbors gathered on his porch. A young mother, clutching her toddler, said, "Mr. Walker, thank you. Because of you." Richard backed off Arlean. "We don't know how to repay you." James gave her a tired but kind smile. "Take care of your family. That's repayment enough." But behind the calm exterior, James and Frank were working tirelessly. Each week, they uncovered more of Richard's dirty laundry, misused funds, double billing, and contracts awarded to his own relatives. The evidence was stacking up, and soon, the HOA board itself began to fracture. Carl, the clipboard man, resigned suddenly, claiming personal reasons. Mrs. Turner grew distant, avoiding public meetings. Richard, however, doubled down. He plastered the neighborhood with letters accusing James of destabilizing the community and exploiting legal loopholes. He even hired a lawyer to intimidate residents into silence. But intimidation no longer worked. James's quiet courage had lit a spark in the community. At the next HOA meeting, residents flooded the clubhouse, demanding answers. James stood in the back, arms crossed, as Richard tried to maintain control. "You don't understand," Richard barked at the crowd. "Without strict rules and dues, property values will collapse, this man." He pointed at James, his finger trembling with rage. "Is destroying everything we've built?" But instead of turning on James, the crowd erupted in jeers at Richard. "You destroyed it yourself," someone shouted. "Where's the money, Richard?" another yelled. James finally stepped forward. "This community doesn't need a dictator. It needs accountability. It needs fairness. I've been fighting bullies my whole life, and I'm not about to stop now. Willow Creek belongs to its people, not one man's greed." The room thundered with applause. Richard's face twisted with fury, but he could see it. The tide had turned. His grip was loosening. Later that week, James closed on 2 more properties. With Frank's guidance, he used rental income to cover costs, reinvesting in the neighborhood. Before long, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving, and with every deed signed, every house secured, Richard's nightmare grew. The very man he tried to crush was now becoming one of the most powerful figures in Willow Creek. One evening, as James watered the roses his late wife had planted, he allowed himself a rare smile. The veteran who once feared losing everything was now protecting not only his home, but the homes of others. But deep down, he knew the final battle hadn't been fought yet. Richard was cornered, and cornered men were dangerous. Richard Miller was unraveling. His once iron grip over Willow Creek had crumbled into whispers and accusations. Homeowners who once trembled at his letters now ignored them. His board was reduced to silence, his allies gone, and his own finances strained. But Richard wasn't the kind of man to surrender quietly. One rainy evening, James returned from the courthouse to find Richard waiting in his driveway. The HOA president's suit was soaked through, his tie askew, his eyes wild with desperation. "You think you've won, Walker?" Richard hissed. "You embarrassed me. You stole from me, but I'll bury you. I'll tie you up in lawsuits until you're bankrupt. You'll regret the day you ever crossed me." James stepped out of his truck, calm but steady, his posture still carrying the weight of a soldier. "I didn't steal from you, Miller. You stole from this community. You tried to take my home, my dignity. Now you've lost both." Richard lunged forward, jabbing a finger in James's chest. But before he could speak again, headlights flashed across the driveway. A black sedan pulled up, and out stepped Frank Delgado, briefcase in hand, flanked by 2 county deputies. Frank's voice was firm. "Richard Miller, you've been served fraud, embezzlement, misuse of HOA funds. We've got everything. The deeds, the bank transfers, the testimonies. You'll be answering for this in court." The deputies handed Richard a stack of papers. His face went pale as he scanned the charges. His lips trembled, but no words came out. For once, the man who had terrorized an entire neighborhood was speechless. James stepped closer, his voice low but clear. "You thought I was just a poor veteran with nothing left. But I've fought men stronger than you, Miller, and I've beaten them all. You don't scare me. You never did." The neighbors began to gather, drawn by the flashing lights. Families stood in the rain, watching their so-called leader crumble. Whispers rose, then cheers, small at first, then louder, until the entire street seemed to roar. The deputies escorted Richard to the car. As the door shut behind him, James felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't victory in the traditional sense. It wasn't medals or parades. It was justice, quiet, steady, and long overdue. Weeks later, Willow Creek voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA and replace it with a resident-led council. With Frank's help, James formalized his ownership of several homes, offering fair rents and even forgiving debts for struggling families. Instead of greed and fear, the neighborhood began to breathe again, united under respect and fairness. On a warm Sunday morning, children played in yards that had once been patrolled by clipboard bullies. Neighbors waved to each other, sharing smiles instead of complaints. And James sat on his porch, the roses blooming around him, a fresh flag fluttering in the breeze. He wasn't just the man they tried to ruin. He was the man who saved Willow Creek. And as he watched the community heal, James Walker whispered the words that had carried him through every battle, every storm, every test. "Never let them break you. Stand your ground, and in the end, you win."